Dominic Carrera threw his head back and laughed. Beat me, and I walk away forever. $100 million. Done. Phones went up instantly. Whispers cut through the courtyard like cold air. Most of the people watching already knew how this was going to end. They looked at the little girl the way people look at something fragile sitting too close to the edge. But Carrera missed something. He didn't see the way her hands were already resting on the dark pieces, not nervous, not exploring, but settled, like they'd been there before. He didn't notice the way her eyes moved across the board, not like a child reading a puzzle, like a general reading a map. And he didn't see her mother standing behind her, still in her work apron, gripping the back of that chair like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She wasn't trembling from fear. She was trembling because she knew. Carrera made his first move. He was still smiling when he did it. 40 minutes later, he would have given back every dollar just to take that smile back. He had $100 million. She had a pink hoodie and her father's lessons. He had 52 years of never losing. She had 2 years of grief that had taught her more about patience than he would ever understand. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. Like this video, subscribe, and stay on, because the next 40 minutes will change the way you see everything. The courtyard of the Meridian Financial Tower had never looked more like a throne room. Tailored suits, gold lapel pins, watches that cost more than the annual salary of everyone who cleaned the building combined. The air itself felt rented, expensive, controlled, belonging to someone. At the center of it all, a chessboard, marble table, rosewood pieces, set up under open sky like a stage that had been dressed for exactly one performance. On one side of that board, a man who had spent 52 years making sure the world understood who it was dealing with. A man whose name made federal prosecutors lower their voices. A man who gripped a white king chess piece in his closed fist and held it up for the crowd. Not like a player preparing to compete. Like a landlord presenting the deed. On the other side, a girl, 9 years old, pink zip-up hoodie, hair in 2 careful braids, her fingers already moving quietly along the dark pieces, not fidgeting, not playing, thinking. Behind her stood her mother, apron still on from the morning shift, hands wrapped around the back of her daughter's chair. 11 years of early mornings and invisible labor in the lines of her face. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't looking at the man who signed her paychecks. She was looking at her daughter. Only her daughter. Because she understood something no one else in that courtyard did yet. This was not a game. It was never a game. It was 11 years of silence answering back. It was dignity that had been made invisible finally stepping into the light. It was a little girl carrying the lessons of a father the world had taken too soon. Walking straight into the most public arena of her life, armed with nothing but everything he left her, poverty versus power, grief versus arrogance, a daughter's love versus a billionaire's pride. And the moment her fingers settled on her first pawn and slid it forward, quiet, certain, unhurried, Dominic Carrera's smile did something it had never done before in 52 years of getting exactly what he wanted. It flickered, just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the photographer standing behind him to catch it on camera. He told himself it meant nothing. He was wrong. But to understand what happened in that courtyard, and why it mattered far beyond a chess game, you need to go back. Back to where this really began. Not on that marble table in the open air, but 11 years earlier, in a 5th-floor office with a mop and a set of keys and a woman who had no choice but to keep her head down. Back to the beginning of Grace Osie's silence, and the daughter who would end it. Before the chessboard, before the courtyard. And before the cameras and the crowd and the moment nobody saw coming, there was a woman, waking up at 4:45 every morning, keeping her head down, paying a price no one around her ever acknowledged, for her daughter. If that hits close to home, like this video, subscribe. because her story deserves to be heard in full. Grace Osei had not always been invisible. In Accra, she had been someone, a woman with a name that people said with warmth, a wife, a partner. Now the kind of person who filled a room not with noise, but with a particular quality of presence, the kind that made other people feel steadier just by being near her. Then Raymond died, and the woman who had been someone became, by necessity, someone else entirely. It happened on a Wednesday morning in March. Sudden cardiac arrest. The doctors used words that were medically precise and humanly useless. Raymond Osei, 41 years old, mathematics professor, and the man who laughed too loudly at his own jokes and cried without embarrassment at airport reunions, was gone before the ambulance arrived. He left behind a wife, a daughter, and a mortgage on a small house in a city that had not yet decided whether it wanted them. Amara was 7 years old. Grace was 34, on a work visa with 18 months remaining and completely alone. She found the job at Carrera Capital through a community board listing. Housekeeper, 5 a.m. to 2 p.m., on Monday through Saturday. No benefits, no sick days that wouldn't cost her. The pay was enough, barely, to cover rent, school fees, and groceries if she was careful. She had been careful every single day for 11 years. She did not complain. She did not ask for things. She learned which hallways to avoid when certain meetings were running late, which executives preferred not to acknowledge the staff, and how to move through a building full of important people as though she occupied no space at all. It was a skill she had not wanted to develop, but she developed it anyway. For Amara, because Amara needed fees paid on time. Amara needed the chess coach at the community center who charged $40 a session and had told Grace, after the third lesson, that her daughter had something he hadn't seen in 20 years of teaching. Amara needed stability, the quiet, an unremarkable kind that only comes from a parent who has decided that their own visibility is the price they will pay for their child's future. Grace paid it without flinching. Every single morning at 4:45 a.m., when the alarm went off and the Chicago winter was still pressing itself against the windows, she paid it. Raymond had introduced Amara to chess when she was 5. Not as a hobby, not as a pastime, as a language. And he was that kind of man, a mathematician who believed that the deepest things in life needed the right structure to be expressed. Emotion confused him sometimes, but logic never did. And so he taught his daughter to speak in moves, in positions, in the quiet vocabulary of a 64-square world where every decision had consequences and nothing was hidden for long. The board never lies, Amara, he told her more than once. It only shows you who you really are. She was a quick student, unnervingly quick. By 6, she was beating neighborhood adults who made the mistake of assuming that a small girl in braids wasn't paying attention. By 7, she was entering under-12 regional tournaments and finishing on podiums that had never been designed with someone her size in mind. By the time she was 9, 2 years after Raymond's heart stopped without warning on an ordinary Wednesday, she had quietly defeated 3 certified club players in timed games. All 3 had shaken her hand afterward with the particular expression of people recalibrating something they thought they already understood. The last game she ever played with her father was at their kitchen table in Accra. A Tuesday evening, the week before, everything changed. The overhead light was yellow and warm. Raymond was in the shirt he always wore when he wasn't teaching, the blue one with the fraying collar that Grace had threatened to throw away 4 separate times. He let her get close that night, closer than usual. Then, quietly, inevitably, he closed the trap she hadn't seen. She stared at the board. He tapped it once with 2 fingers, gently, the way he always did when he wanted her to really hear something. The pieces don't care who's richer, baby girl, he smiled. They only care who's smarter. It started, as most irreversible things do, with a small and ordinary moment that no one recognized as a door until it had already been walked through. 3 days before the game. A Friday evening, the 34th floor executive lounge. Amara was waiting for her mother. Grace's shift ran until 2 p.m. on weekdays. But Fridays sometimes stretched longer, a board meeting requiring extra setup, a conference room that needed turning over before Monday. Amara had learned to bring her school bag and wait in the corridor outside the service elevator, reading or doing homework. Invisible the way her mother had quietly taught her to be invisible in spaces like this. But on this particular Friday, the corridor door was propped open, and through it, past the glass partition and the low-leather furniture and the wall of city-facing windows, she saw the chess set. Rosewood board, ivory and obsidian pieces, sitting on the coffee table like a sculpture, arranged in the starting position, untouched. Decorative in the way that expensive things in rooms like that are always decorative, purchased to signal something, never actually used. Amara sat down in front of it. She didn't decide to, exactly. She simply moved toward it the way she always moved toward chessboards, with the automatic gravity of someone returning to a language they think in. She set her bag on the floor, studied the opening position for a moment, and began to play both sides in silence. She was 6 moves in when Marco Reyes appeared in the doorway. Marco was Carrera's head of security, a compact, watchful man who had held the position for 9 years by being the kind of person who noticed everything and reacted to nothing visibly. He noticed the girl immediately. He radioed it in without expression and then stood in the doorway and waited. Carrera arrived 4 minutes later. He came expecting to deal with a trespasser, a minor inconvenience. And he stood in the doorway where Marco had been standing and looked at the child sitting cross-legged on his $4,000 leather sofa, moving pieces on his decorative chess set with the focused calm of someone who had forgotten, or simply didn't care, that the room belonged to someone else. He watched for 4 minutes without speaking. Later, he would tell people that he'd been amused. That would be partially true. But there was something else in those 4 minutes. Something he wouldn't name. Hassan wouldn't examine. The unsettling quality of watching a child do something adult. The slight disorientation of entering a room expecting to be the most significant presence in it and finding inexplicably that you might not be. He covered it the only way men like him know how to cover it. He laughed. "You know how to play, little girl?" Amara didn't look up. She finished the move she was considering, a bishop, repositioned deliberately, and then raised her eyes. "Yes." One word. Had no apology in it, no performance, just the flat, clean fact of it. Carrera smiled. The smile that had closed deals and ended careers and charmed 3 different federal investigators into looking elsewhere. "Tell you what, you beat me. I write your mother a check big enough to retire on. How does that sound?" Grace appeared from the service corridor then, still holding a cleaning cloth, her face going pale the moment she read the room. "Sir, I'm so sorry. She knows she's not supposed to—" "Tuesday," Carrera said, not looking at Grace, still looking at Amara. "Courtyard. I'll have cameras there." His smile widened. "It'll be a good story." He believed that completely. A good story. For him. The generous billionaire who played chess with the housekeeper's daughter and let the cameras see it. Magnanimous. Untouchable. The kind of image money alone couldn't manufacture. What he didn't know was that Marco had already made 3 calls before Carrera arrived on the 34th floor. The press invitation had gone out before the offer was even made. This had never been conceived as a private moment, and the photographer who responded to that invitation, a freelancer named Daniel Avery, was not, as Carrera's PR team believed, from a society lifestyle magazine. And he had been investigating Carrera Capital's financial relationships with the City Zoning Commission for 8 months. He had been trying to get inside that building for 6. He accepted the assignment within 11 minutes of receiving it. Tuesday morning. their apartment. 6:45 a.m. Grace sat behind Amara on the edge of the bed, working through her daughter's hair with the quiet, practiced rhythm of 1,000 previous mornings. Neither of them had slept particularly well. Grace's hands moved steadily regardless. She didn't say what she was thinking. She had spent 11 years learning not to say what she was thinking in relation to Dominic Carrera, and the habit held even here, even now, even in the privacy of their own home. Amara watched her mother's face in the mirror, read it the way she read chessboards, not the surface, but the structure underneath. Then she reached up and covered her mother's hand with her own, just for a moment, just long enough. Mom. Grace met her daughter's eyes in the reflection. I've played harder games than this. By 1 p.m., the courtyard had filled the way water fills a low place, quickly, inevitably, from every available direction. Word had moved through the Meridian Financial Tower the way gossip always moves through buildings built on hierarchy, fast at the bottom, faster in the middle, and arriving at the top already shaped into something useful. By noon, the lobby security staff knew. By 12:30, at the administrative assistants on floors 8 through 20 knew. By 12:50, people who had no particular reason to be in the courtyard on a Tuesday afternoon were finding particular reasons. They leaned over railings on the upper floors, phones already raised. They gathered in loose clusters near the building's glass exterior, pressing slightly forward, the collective body language of people who have arrived expecting to watch something confirming happen, and something that would make sense of the world as they already understood it. Nobody came down to watch the little girl win. Carrera arrived at 1 p.m. exactly. He moved through the crowd the way he moved through every room, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to wonder whether there would be space made for him. His navy suit was immaculate. The gold lapel pin caught the afternoon light. He shook hands as he walked, associates, building managers, but two men in suits whose precise relationship to him was unclear but whose deference was not. He reached the marble table, picked up the white king from the board, held it up briefly for no one in particular, an instinctive gesture, theatrical and unconscious, the chess equivalent of testing a microphone before a speech. Someone in the crowd cheered, others laughed. Carrera smiled and set the piece back down. Daniel Avery, positioned 8 feet behind and slightly to the left, raised his camera and took the first shot. Amara was already seated. She had been there for 4 minutes before Carrera arrived, and she had spent those 4 minutes doing what she always did before a game, settling. Each dark piece lifted and placed with deliberate care, not adjusting anything the setup required adjusting, but making each piece hers in the small, private way that serious players do before a match. A ritual without ceremony, a conversation that hadn't started yet. Oh, she did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Carrera when he arrived, or when the crowd cheered, or when he picked up the white king and performed for the cameras. She looked at the board. Behind her, Grace stood with both hands resting on the back of the chair. She had come directly from her shift, apron still on, the morning's work still in the set of her shoulders. She did not scan the crowd. She did not look at the man across the table who signed her paychecks. She looked only at Amara, watching her daughter's hands move quietly among the pieces and finding in that stillness the only thing that was keeping her own breathing steady. Carrera opened with a 4. King's pawn, 2 squares forward. The oldest aggressive opening in the game, played fast and without deliberation. A move designed less to pressure an opponent and more to announce to everyone watching that the person making it knows what they're doing and isn't afraid of you knowing it. The crowd responded to the speed of it. A few people nodded. One of his associates made a low sound of approval. Amara looked at the board. 12 seconds passed. The crowd murmured. Someone near the back laughed, the short, knowing laugh of confirmed expectations. Carrera leaned back in his chair and glanced at his associates with the easy smile of a man watching something go exactly as planned. "Take your time, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." More laughter. And he was performing well, and he knew it. Amara moved her pawn, sat back, returned her gaze to the board. 5 moves in, Carrera was still smiling. He had no reason not to be. The crowd was with him. The cameras were running. The morning was going exactly as he had designed it to go. He looked across the table at the girl. Really looked briefly, the way you look at something you're not concerned about, and found her already looking somewhere else. Not at him, not at the crowd, at the board. But not the surface of it, somewhere inside it. Her eyes moving in that particular way, slow, thorough, architectural, that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the man who had spent 2 years sitting across from her at a kitchen table in Accra, tapping the wood gently, teaching her to see what wasn't visible yet. Raymond Osei's eyes, quiet, reading. Already 3 moves ahead of a room that hadn't noticed yet. The crowd saw a little girl moving slowly. They saw hesitation, in nerves, someone out of her depth. They were watching the wrong thing entirely. If this story is reminding you that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous one, like this video and subscribe, because the next few moves are going to prove it in a way that nobody in that courtyard is going to forget. The laughter didn't die all at once. It thinned, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way light thins in the hour before a storm. Not gone yet, but changed in quality. And something in the air of the courtyard, shifting from entertainment into attention, though most of the people standing there couldn't have said exactly when or why. It started on move 14. Carrera reached for his bishop. A natural move, logical, aggressive, the kind of move that consolidates control and signals to the opponent, and to anyone watching, that the person making it understands the board and is not being careful with you. His hand moved toward it with the automatic confidence of the previous 13 moves. Then it stopped. His fingers hovered over the piece for 2 seconds, maybe 3. He recalculated something small, something internal, and then withdrew his hand, shifted it slightly, and moved a pawn instead. It was a minor adjustment, the kind of thing that happens in serious games constantly. But this was not supposed to be a serious game. The crowd felt the pause without understanding it. A subtle recalibration in the energy of the courtyard, the way an audience shifts when something on stage happens that wasn't in the program. One of Carrera's associates near the left side of the table stopped smiling and looked at the board with the effortful concentration of a man pretending he could read what he was seeing. Marco Reyes, standing 6 feet back and slightly to the right, said nothing. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened by a fraction, the tell of a careful man absorbing new information. Amara responded in 4 seconds, not to the pawn move, or not only to it. She responded in the way that made Grace's breath catch behind her, with the particular quality of readiness that goes beyond preparation into something closer to prophecy, as if she had mapped both options, the bishop and the pawn, and had simply been waiting to see which path he would choose before selecting the response she had already prepared for it. 4 seconds, pawn forward, hands back in her lap. Carrera looked at the board. By move 18, the queenside pressure was undeniable. To anyone who knew what they were looking at, it wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden captures, no visible devastation, no single moment the crowd could point to and say that's where it changed. It was architectural, patient. A slow, relentless tightening that didn't announce itself, just accumulated. One move building on the last, each position slightly worse than the one before it. A hand closing around something so gradually that by the time you felt the pressure, it had been there for some time already. Carrera was still leaning back in his chair, still composed, but the smile was doing less work now. The performance had quietly suspended itself, replaced by something more private and considerably less comfortable. Move 22. Amara moved a pawn forward and took his rook. The crowd reacted immediately, a collective intake of breath, then murmuring, then a short laugh from somewhere near the back. A pawn taking a rook. The most powerful piece on the board surrendered to its weakest. It looked like an error. It looked like exactly the kind of mistake you'd expect from a 9-year-old who'd gotten lucky through the early game, but finally shown her ceiling. Carrera almost laughed. The expression started, the reflex of a man who has been waiting for confirmation that the world still makes sense the way he arranged it. Then he looked at what the capture had opened. The laugh didn't come. Behind him, Grace's hands tightened on the back of the chair until the knuckles whitened. She recognized the move. Raymond had a name for it. The quiet door. A sacrifice that looks like carelessness. A pawn offered like an apology, opening a diagonal, a file, a pathway that would take 3 moves to become visible and could not be closed once it did. He had shown it to Amara the winter she turned 7. She had used it twice in tournament play since then. Both times, her opponent hadn't seen it coming until it was already finished. 8 feet behind Carrera, Daniel Avery had stopped photographing the board entirely. He was photographing the man. He had been doing so for the last 4 minutes, capturing Carrera's face every 30 seconds with the methodical patience of someone who understood that what was developing in front of his lens was not a chess story. The hovered hand on move 14. The recalculation. The moment just now when the laugh started and stopped. For 40 minutes of an unguarded face belonging to a man currently under quiet federal scrutiny. Expressions that no PR statement would be able to contextualize once they were in print. Carrera didn't know. He was looking at the board. He leaned forward now, elbows on the table. The posture of a man who has stopped performing and started working. The involuntary shift from theater into something real. The crowd felt it. They didn't know what they were feeling exactly, and they couldn't read the board. They couldn't name the position or explain why the last several moves had produced this particular quality of silence. But they felt it. The laughter was gone. And in its place, something that hadn't been invited and didn't belong to Carrera's script, a collective, uncertain, held-breath sense that the story they'd come down here to watch might not be the story that was actually being told. The board blurred. Not from tears, not yet. And just from the particular unfocusing that happens when the mind, overwhelmed by the weight of a present moment, reaches backward for something solid to hold on to. Grace let it. She had learned, over 11 years of keeping herself composed in spaces that didn't belong to her, how to be somewhere else without leaving, how to stand perfectly still while the interior moved. She let it move now. Her first day at Carrera Capital had been a Monday in November. She remembered the cold, Chicago cold. The kind that has intent behind it, nothing like the cool Harmattan winds she'd grown up with in Accra. She remembered standing in the service entrance at 4:52 a.m. with her identification and her paperwork and the careful, neutral expression she had already begun practicing in the mirror at home. Marco Reyes had handed her the supply cart without looking at her. He'd pointed down the corridor, said, "Floors 32 through 35, start at the top," and walked away. Not unkindly. As simply as though she were a function rather than a person. A task that had been completed, equipment distributed, orientation done. She had cleaned all 4 floors by 9 a.m. Carrera had walked past her 3 times that first week, once in the corridor outside the executive lounge, once near the elevator banks on 34, once directly past the supply cart she was pushing through the atrium. Each time she had shifted slightly to make more room, the automatic courtesy of someone who has learned to take up less space. He had not looked at her once. She had understood then what kind of invisible she was going to be required to be, and she had accepted it. Not happily, but practically, the way you accept weather. Because Amara needed the school fees paid, because the visa required continuous employment, because there was no version of pride she could afford that cost her daughter's stability. She had picked up the mop and kept going. At the morning after Raymond died, she had come to work. She had not wanted to. Every part of her had wanted to stay in the apartment, in the chair beside the window where Raymond used to read on Sunday mornings, and simply not move for a very long time. But the rent was due in 11 days, and there was no one else. She had cleaned the 34th floor executive bathroom with eyes so swollen the fluorescent light hurt. She had worked slowly, carefully. Or the way you work when functioning is the only thing standing between you and complete collapse. No one had asked why she was crying. Not Marco. Not the two executives she passed in the corridor. Not the building manager who nodded at her near the service elevator. She had not expected them to. But she remembered it nonetheless. The particular texture of that silence. The way grief, in a place like that, was simply another thing that didn't belong to her. Memory 3 came softer than the others. Amara at 6. Her first tournament, a Saturday morning at a community center in Pilsen, folding tables and paper cups of water and children who mostly didn't know what they were doing yet. Amara had known. She'd won 4 straight games without drama, each one finished with the same quiet finality. And afterward, Raymond had lifted her onto his shoulders in the parking lot and walked 3 full circles around the car while Amara laughed from up there. The pure, unconstructed laugh of a child who hasn't learned yet to make herself smaller. Grace had laughed too. Really laughed. From the chest, without thinking about it. The kind of laughter that doesn't know it's being stored as the last of its kind. The world got hard 7 months later. The laughing like that had not come back. And she returned to the present, slowly. To the courtyard. The silence of the crowd. The board on the marble table with its shifting architecture of consequence. And her daughter's hands, moving a piece now, settling it with that quiet, unshakable certainty. Raymond's hands, shaped by Raymond's patience, carrying Raymond's lessons into a room he would never see. He gave her that, Grace thought. Even from wherever he is now. He gave her that. She had been invisible in this building for 11 years. She had learned the hallways and the schedules and the precise dimensions of the space she was permitted to occupy. She had made herself small and consistent and unremarkable, and she had done it without bitterness because it was what Amara needed. But today, through no arrangement of her own, through no plan she had made or request she had filed, she was the most visible person in this courtyard. Every phone raised, or every eye on the board, every held breath in this gathered crowd was connected, however indirectly, to the child she had raised alone in a city that never learned her name. She hadn't asked for it, she hadn't arranged for it. It had simply come, the way truth always comes eventually, without permission and without apology. Grace closed her eyes. Not praying exactly, just finding the place inside herself where Raymond still lived and speaking to it directly. The way you speak to someone when the thing you always hoped for is finally, actually, happening in front of you. She's doing it, Ray. She's doing it. She opened her eyes, drew one slow breath, and straightened her back, fully, completely without apology, standing taller in that building than she had permitted herself to stand in 11 years. There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with quiet. It is the silence of a room full of people who have stopped performing their reactions and started having them. No more murmuring, no more phones nudging neighbors, no more half-laughs at the edges of the crowd, just people standing very still, watching something they didn't come here expecting to watch, feeling the specific discomfort of a certainty dissolving beneath them. That silence had settled over the courtyard somewhere between move 26 and 28. No one could have said exactly when. It had arrived the way Amara played, without announcement, without drama, simply present before anyone noticed it coming. The sequence she built from move 28 was not beautiful in any way the crowd could have named. It was not a series of dramatic captures. There were no gasps, no sudden reversals, no single devastating blow that the audience could point to as the moment. It was something quieter and considerably more final than that. It was architecture. Each move placing a wall where Carrera needed a door. Each response he gave, logical, searching, the moves of a man who still believed there was a solution to be found if he just looked hard enough, opening something worse than what it closed. He was not playing badly. That was the merciless part. He was playing well by any reasonable standard. He was playing the way he had always played, with experience, with intelligence, not with the pattern recognition of a man who had competed and won across 50 years of the game. But Amara was playing at a different altitude entirely, and the gap between those two altitudes, which had been invisible in the early game, was now the only thing visible. Move 28, her bishop repositioned. A quiet move. The crowd didn't react. Move 29, a pawn advanced one square, still quiet, still patient. Carrera's associates had stopped smiling by move 27. Now, on move 29, two of them took a small, simultaneous, probably unconscious step back from the table, the physical vocabulary of people beginning to separate themselves from an outcome. Marco Reyes noticed. Marco Reyes noticed everything, but his attention was elsewhere now. He had been watching the photographer for the last several minutes. Something had registered at the edge of his professional awareness. The angle Avery was shooting from, the frequency of the shots, or the fact that the lens had not been directed at the board in some time. Marco pulled out his phone, ran the name against the Society magazine Carrera's PR team had confirmed the assignment through. The name wasn't there. He cross-referenced it. 30 seconds. Then his face did something it very rarely did in professional settings. It drained. He moved to Carrera's side and leaned down. Spoke quietly, directly, the three words that were intended to pull Carrera's attention away from the board immediately. Carrera waved him off without looking up. He couldn't look up. He was somewhere inside the position, still searching, still believing in the existence of a move that would change the shape of what was happening. Marco straightened, looked once more at Avery, looked back at Carrera, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man whose job is to anticipate damage, that the damage was already done. I move 30. Carrera pushed his queen forward aggressively, a diagonal strike toward Amara's kingside, bold and destabilizing, the chess equivalent of a man flipping the table. It was a counterattack built not from position, but from desperation, designed to inject chaos into a game that had become too ordered, too inevitable, too much like a room with the exits sealed. The crowd stirred. A sound moved through them. The brief, a hopeful murmur of people who wanted this to be the moment he found something, who needed, for reasons they couldn't entirely explain, to believe the world still worked the way it had when they arrived. Amara looked up. For the first time in 20 minutes, she raised her eyes from the board and looked directly at Dominic Carrera. Not with triumph, not with anger, not with the performative calm of someone playing to the audience. With clarity, the quiet, and almost sorrowful clarity of someone who has been watching a particular ending approach for a very long time and has arrived, finally, at the last few steps of it. She moved her knight. One move. Unhurried. Inevitable. Carrera's queen, his desperate, aggressive, chaos-seeking queen, was not captured. It was rendered irrelevant. The knight didn't take it. It didn't need to. It simply landed on a square that made the queen's position not aggressive, but exposed. not threatening, but stranded. At the bold piece now isolated in enemy territory with no support and no retreat. His counterattack had not failed. It had become, in the space of one move, the primary instrument of his defeat. The crowd went completely still. Move 31. The position required no explanation. It required no commentary from the people standing around it, who couldn't fully read it. It communicated itself, the way certain truths communicate themselves, through the quality of the silence it produced. Carrera sat without moving for a long moment. Then, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man managing the only thing he had left to manage, his own visible composure, he reached up and removed his glasses. He set them on the table beside the board. He looked at the position one more time, not searching now. The searching was finished. This was something different. The final look of a man who has spent 52 years deciding what he would and wouldn't accept, confronting, for perhaps the first time, something that had not consulted his preferences before arriving. He wasn't looking for a move. He was just looking. His hand moved toward his king. It hovered there, suspended, neither committing nor retreating, the whole courtyard holding its breath around that single suspended gesture. While above the board, 40 minutes of unguarded photographs sat in a camera that had never been pointed where he thought it was pointing. He laid his king on its side. And the gesture was small, controlled, the hand steady, the motion deliberate, not a concession thrown down in frustration but placed, carefully, with the last reserves of a dignity that had been rehearsed over 52 years into something close to reflex. The king touched the board on its side, and Dominic Carrera's hand withdrew and settled in his lap. That was all. No words. No dramatic pause extended for effect. No final attempt to reframe what had just happened into something more manageable. In just a king on its side on a marble table in the open air, and the man who put it there sitting very still looking at it. 2 seconds of silence. Then the applause began. It started from above, from the upper floors, the people leaning over railings who had the widest view and had been watching the longest. A handful of hands at first, then more, spreading downward through the crowd the way the silence had spread earlier, but in reverse, filling the courtyard from the top down, the building in layers until it was everywhere at once, full and unambiguous, and belonging entirely to the girl in the pink hoodie who still hadn't moved from her chair. Amara didn't raise her fists. She didn't stand. She didn't turn to the crowd or perform anything for the cameras that were now pointing uniformly at her. She exhaled. One long, slow breath. The breath of someone who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has finally been given permission to set it down. She looked at the board for a moment, the completed position, the architecture of 40 minutes rendered in its final form. Then she turned and looked at her mother. Grace was already crying, not with sound, not with the kind of crying that asks for witness or comfort. Silently, both hands pressed over her mouth. Tears moving without permission down her face. The tears of a woman who has held herself composed through 11 years of early mornings and invisible labor and a grief that no one in this building ever acknowledged, and has finally arrived at a moment that she did not arrange and could not have predicted and cannot quite believe is real. She reached forward and placed one hand on Amara's shoulder. Amara reached up and covered her mother's hand with her own. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The language between them had never required words for its most important things. Carrera stood. He adjusted his jacket, the automatic muscle memory gesture of a man for whom composure is not a choice but a practice, maintained through decades of high-stakes rooms and difficult mornings and moments far worse than this one. He reached into his jacket, removed a pen, and signed the check on the marble table. The same table where 40 minutes earlier he had held up a white king for the cameras and let the crowd cheer. He slid it across the board without ceremony. Then he looked at Amara. Not the way he had looked at her on the 34th floor 3 days ago, when she was a function he was deciding how to use. Not the way he had looked at her when he arrived in the courtyard, that lazy, a surface survey of something so far beneath consideration it barely registered. He looked at her the way people look at things that have genuinely surprised them. The specific recalibrating attention of a man discovering that a category he constructed confidently has turned out to be wrong in every particular. He extended his hand. Amara shook it, firmly, without ceremony, without performance in either direction. Marco Reyes reached Carrera's side at the same moment, pushing through the thinning crowd with the controlled urgency of a man delivering news that needed to have arrived sooner. He spoke quietly, directly. Carrera listened, his expression not changing visibly, though something behind his eyes shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the chess game. Across the courtyard, Daniel Avery was already moving toward the exit, camera bag over one shoulder, unhurried. He had what he came for. But he had known for the last 20 minutes that he had it. 40 minutes of unguarded expressions on a face that federal investigators had been trying to read for 8 months. Every hesitation, every recalculation, every moment where the mask had slipped by a fraction and something true had shown through underneath. No PR statement would be able to explain away what his lens had documented today. The math was already done. The crowd waited. Carrera turned to face them. The people who had come down here to watch him win, who had laughed at his jokes and cheered when he held up the White King, who were now standing in the courtyard of his own building wearing the particular expression of people who have watched something they didn't expect and aren't sure yet what it means. He opened his mouth. The words didn't come. For 3 full seconds, in front of his own cameras, his own building, his own people, with the applause still settling and the courtyard still watching, Dominic Carrera stood with his mouth open and nothing in it. No performance, no reframe, no version of this moment that served him. Just a man in a navy suit with nothing to say. When he finally spoke, it was quietly, without theater, without any of the amplification that had characterized every other word he'd said since arriving in this courtyard. She's extraordinary. 3 words, and the most honest thing he had said in years. Possibly the most honest thing he had said in this building ever. The courtyard received them in silence, and somehow in that silence, in the plainness of it, in the complete absence of spin or management or careful positioning, those 3 small words did more damage to Dominic Carrera's carefully constructed image than anything that had happened on the board, because they were true, and everyone present could hear that they were true. And the camera was still running. By evening, the chess game was already yesterday's story. Daniel Avery's photographs ran at 7 p.m. on a financial news platform with a readership that had no particular interest in chess and considerable interest in the man whose face occupied the center of every frame. The piece was not titled what Carrera's PR team had anticipated. It was not a story about generosity. It was not a story about a billionaire's afternoon in the courtyard of his own building. It was a study in unguarded expression, 40 minutes of a powerful man's face, sequenced chronologically, paired with 8 months of quietly accumulated questions about Carrera Capital's contractual relationships with the City Zoning Commission. The hover on move 14. The moment the laugh didn't come. The jaw set against something it couldn't control. The 3 seconds of open-mouthed silence at the end, in front of his own cameras, with nothing to say. And the images Carrera had commissioned to show his magnanimity showed something else entirely. Something considerably harder to manage. His attorneys called Avery's editor that night. The call did not accomplish what it was intended to accomplish. 1 week later, 2 of the photographs were picked up by 4 major publications. The image that ran most widely was not the checkmate. It was Move 22, Amara's hand on the knight, her eyes raised and direct. Carrera's jaw tight with the specific tension of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already settled. Grace's knuckles white on the back of the chair, slightly out of focus in the background, present nonetheless. Carrera's PR team issued a statement describing the coverage as misleading and the framing as deliberately reductive. The statement was professionally worded and carefully constructed and received with the particular public skepticism that attaches itself to carefully constructed statements from people with reasons to issue them. Nobody believed it exactly. Nobody said so exactly. The photographs simply continued to circulate, and the questions they carried continued to accumulate, and the statement sat beside them like a handwritten note taped to a window in a storm. 1 month after the game, a federal inquiry into Carrera Capital's contracts with the City Zoning Commission was formally opened. Carrera's legal team described it as routine. They described the timing as coincidental. They described the connection between a chess game and a federal inquiry as the kind of narrative construction that the press engages in for readership rather than accuracy. The timing did not agree with them, and the federal investigators, and who had been looking for sufficient public pressure to formalize 8 months of preliminary work, did not particularly need the legal team's characterization. The inquiry opened on a Tuesday, the same day of the week as the game. Nobody planned that. Some things simply arrive with a symmetry that no one arranged. Carrera honored the check, perhaps because fighting it publicly would have cost him more than the amount on it. Perhaps because something in him, some small, stubborn residue of the honesty he demonstrated in those 3 final words, held. Grace received it without drama, deposited it without ceremony, and gave 3 months' notice the following Monday morning. She worked every one of those 3 months without changing a single thing about her routine. Same shift, same floors, same cart, same neutral, unhurried professionalism she had brought to the building every morning for 11 years. She left on a Friday afternoon in February. She did not make an announcement. She did not say goodbye to Marco Reyes or to the building manager or to any of the executives on the upper floors whose names she knew and who did not know hers. She collected her bag from the service locker, walked out through the same entrance she had walked in through on a cold Monday in November 11 years earlier. The 34th floor was quieter the following Monday. Several people noticed without knowing why. 4 months after the game, Amara entered the Under-12 State Chess Championship. She won. 12 rounds over 2 days, each one finished with the same quiet finality that had characterized every serious game she'd ever played. The tournament director, shaking her hand afterward, asked how long she'd been playing competitively. "Since I was 5, she said. "My dad taught me." The local paper ran a small story on the back page of the Metro section. A photograph of Amara holding the trophy, her mother standing beside her, both of them looking directly at the camera with the steady, uncomplicated ease of people who have nothing left to prove. Grace kept the clipping in her wallet. She kept it behind the photograph of Raymond, the one from the parking lot after Amara's first tournament, the one where he was laughing with his whole face, his daughter on his shoulders, the whole world apparently manageable from that particular height. The clipping and the photograph sat together in the worn sleeve of her wallet, are side by side, for a long time after that. On a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the championship, Amara sat alone at the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet. Grace was reading in the next room. The overhead light was yellow and warm, the same quality of light that had fallen on a kitchen table in Accra on a Tuesday evening, on the last game she ever played with her father. She opened the wooden travel case he had left her. Small, worn at the corners, the brass hinges gone slightly green. She took out the pieces one at a time and set them in their starting positions, the way he had taught her, the same sequence every time, never skipping a step, never rushing the setup. Pawns first, then rooks, then knights and bishops, then the queen on her own color, the black king last. She placed it at the center of its square, looked at it for a moment, Just a moment. Then she began to play, both sides, quietly, completely focused. And already somewhere 3 moves ahead of where the pieces currently stood, already in the middle of a conversation no one else could hear, with a man who had taught her that the board never lies and that the pieces don't care who's richer, and that the most important moves are the ones that don't announce themselves until it's already too late to stop them. Some victories don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with noise or celebration or fists raised in the air. And they don't come with cameras pointed in the right direction or crowds who understood what they were watching while it was happening. They arrive the way truth always arrives, quietly, inevitably, and exactly on time. The board never lies. Raymond Osei taught his daughter that at a kitchen table in Accra, in the yellow light of an ordinary evening, with 2 fingers tapped gently on the wood, and a patience that asked nothing in return except that she remember. She remembered. And on a Tuesday afternoon in downtown Chicago, in front of cameras that were never meant to capture what they captured, in a courtyard full of people who came to watch one story and left having witnessed another, a 9-year-old girl in a pink hoodie proved it, in front of everyone, without saying a single word. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that brilliance doesn't announce itself, and that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones worth watching most carefully. Like, follow and stay close, because the next story is already in motion.